One of those important points we made was that we had learned pretty much early on that they were not going to pursue the death penalty in this, and it was interesting to see some of those jury instructions, the judge giving those jurors something like 20 or 22 different points to consider. Again, you know, this perhaps may have been the first trial that these jurors have ever been a part of, and it is a very important trial, a highly visible trial, as you're there with so many other representatives of the media from not only Colorado but around the country. A lot of eyeballs on this.
Oh, Rob, yes, there are dozens of cameras here. They're lined up on either side of me right now. A lot of people cared about this case. They took interest in this case. Remember how it started with Kelsey Barrett disappearing on Thanksgiving Day. We didn't know about that until a few weeks later. We saw that surveillance video of her inside the grocery store with her little daughter going to pick up things for Thanksgiving, and that was on the 22nd. So these guilty verdicts coming in just days before the anniversary of her death.
Yeah, the timing is unbelievable that they got this wrapped up in a year. And another key thing that we commented on when the trial was winding down was the fact that the prosecution took a long time to present a very meticulous case, a long timeline to piece this all together, and then when they rested and then turned it over to the defense calls no witnesses, and Patrick Frazee basically told the judge, I'm going to remain silent. So I wonder what kind of message that sent to the jury.
Absolutely, and remember, over the past year, no sign of Kelsey's body. Remember, they looked through the landfill for months to find any kind of piece of evidence that her body might be in there. So coming into this trial, you're wondering, what's the prosecution going to have? They don't have a body, but they came out swinging in this case. They started with Crystal Kenny saying she cleaned up the crime scene. She came in day 2 or 3, detailing how she cleaned up the crime scene. There was a video of her walking investigators through, showing where all the blood was. That was a lot of the video evidence that came through. She showed them where the body had been burned at the Nash Ranch, and investigators even finding a fragment of a tooth, but couldn't come to the conclusion of whether or not that was her tooth because it was just such a small scrap. But the tote, they thought that there was evidence that the black tote that her body had been in was burned in that fire. Also, on the final day of testimony, which was Friday, that's when we heard from an inmate that had been in jail with Patrick Frazee and said that Patrick Frazee tried to put a hit on all the witnesses in this case that were going to speak out against him. He had all the evidence on paper towels with Patrick Frazee's handwriting, with names and addresses and phone numbers, and saying that one of the witnesses had lots of money. And so that came out on the final day. So the prosecution really did their homework. They sold it to this jury that Patrick Frazee murdered Kelsey Bennett.
Yeah, and we saw that timeline also put together with all those cell phone connections. And one other thing that was interesting to show the ignorance of Patrick Frazee, frankly, when he had found out that some of his phones had been tapped, but still had thrown out in some conversation or another about no body, no case, whoever he was referring to at that time. But basically, our Sam Kramer did a story, what was it, 2 or 3 weeks ago, right before that trial started, saying that there are actually a higher conviction rate of cases where no body is presented as opposed to those where a body is presented during a trial. But again, prosecutors confident in the information and evidence and testimony that they had to move forward with this, and obviously they were right.
Right, and Joseph Moore, I believe, was the friend's name who testified against him, who is a rancher who has known Patrick Frazee for 20 years or so. He said that he had figured out a way to kill her, and no body, no crime. And Joseph Moore was like, don't talk like that. And he would berate her in front of him. And he just said he found a way to do it. And apparently he did.
And if folks are just joining us right now, that Teller County jury in Cripple Creek has now found Patrick Frazee guilty on all 6 counts: first-degree murder with deliberation, solicitation to commit, tampering with deceased human body. And again, those are there was no ifs, ands, or buts here. And we were curious about if, in fact, it may have gone to a lesser charge, how long this jury would deliberate. But again, 2.5, 3 hours before they came to a decision. Obviously, it seems as though there were a few things they had to still reconsider, the audio and video that we mentioned they asked about, but it sounded like they were pretty solid all along, and as you mentioned, they were all polled and said, yes, this man is guilty.
Yes, and Patrick Frazee, according to Sam Kramer, looked as if he was about to cry, looks as if he could cry when that verdict was being handed down, being read by the judge to the courtroom. Dan May, right before the district attorney, right before I noticed him, he was sort of going back and forth in his seat, waiting for the jury to come in, waiting to see if they proved this case, which they did. So a big victory to the prosecution. Great job by them. And you can see we have all the microphones set up. We are waiting for them to come outside of the courthouse after sentencing is done. And he will likely come out and give a statement to us and answer some reporter questions, because as you said, this is a huge draw to national media and media all over, and everyone is anxiously awaiting to see what they have to say after this verdict came down. And now we'll have to wait on the sentencing. As you take a look into the Teller County Courthouse right now, that's where it's all happening. We're still waiting from Sam Kramer. He's inside there. As soon as the sentencing is handed down, he'll come out. He will let us know what happened with that. So we are just waiting for that right now.
Yeah, and just to kind of reiterate some of the instructions that the jury was given by the judge here this morning. Again, this is basic legal procedure here, presumed innocent until proven guilty. The mere number of witnesses testifying or the length of time is not indicative of a guilty or an innocent decision here. They are the sole judge of a witness's credibility, and that is key, because really it was all circumstantial evidence for the most part on the part of the prosecution. So these jurors had to believe that these were credible witnesses. Crystal Kenny was credible, that these experts on the phone calls, the jailhouse inmate, etc., extremely credible witnesses, and that was the key to this guilty verdict here this afternoon.
And we are still waiting to hear what happens with Crystal Kenny, because she did take a plea deal, but she'll be sentenced after this. But prosecutors needed her to take on this case and give her testimony, explain everything that happened on the stand, which she did. And the closing arguments, Sam Kramer says, was very powerful inside this morning. The key takeaways from the prosecution, just a powerful closing. They stressed that Patrick Frazee planned this whole thing. The courtroom was about 95% full all day while the closing arguments were given. I'm trying to look at Sam's notes a little bit, because the defense closing arguments, he said, let's see, they stressed the story was made up and that the foundation is very shaky and that Crystal Kenny is not trustworthy. And if this was Patrick Frazee's plan, that was a dumb plan. Prosecution, though, was able to give a rebuttal to the closing argument. They said the defense is asking the jury to speculate on this, and Dan May said, criminals aren't smart, so what do you expect? And then they took about 3.5 hours and came down with guilty on all counts. Yeah, and I'm curious to hear from Sam the demeanor of Dan May, because I had also copied some of those notes that Sam had written about what he was saying to the jury during his closing arguments, and he said just repeatedly saying that he beat her, and he beat her, and he beat her. I mean, it was just, I could just imagine the force and the power of that expression to that jury, and looking at their face and wondering how they were reacting to this. But again, a very impassioned plea from Dan May. And, again, we just cringed and were so upset when we heard that her final words, just imagine saying, "Will you please stop?" I mean, just to try and visualize what was going on in those final moments of her life, it's just heartbreaking. Just heartbreaking, and to know that she has a little girl that's going to be raised without her mom and without her dad, most likely, and there's still a custody issue to be worked out there as well. Kaylee has been living with her grandparents, Kelsey's parents, throughout this, and so we'll see what happens there. It's likely that after this conviction that they'll get to keep custody of her, which is just so sad to think of this little girl being raised without her mother. The jury instructions, no research of this case until the verdict is reached. The defendant charged with first-degree murder, felony first-degree murder, solicitation, tampering. He pleaded not guilty. He says the charges are not evidence, they're accusations. Every person charged with a crime is presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and that's what the prosecution had to work on. And it's interesting that you bring up the he beat her and he beat her, because on Friday, before we heard from that inmate who said that Patrick Frazee wanted to put a hit on everyone, the testimony was from an investigator that was talking about the blood splatter, because all the blood splatter was very small marks that they did find. But he says the impact of being beaten like that would lead to tiny little minuscule blood marks all over. When he swings the bat up, the blood might fly off of it. So, and he came to the conclusion she had been beaten at least 10 to 15 times before her body was ultimately burned. And just such a sad story, but hopefully this guilty verdict on all counts gives the family a little bit of closure.
Yeah, I wonder now with that guilty verdict if Patrick Frazee will come clean with everybody and say, you know, to give this family some closure. You know, obviously, I don't know what's going through his mind. He's obviously a sociopath. But to say, tell us where the body is, you know, give the family some closure. We want to, you know, as much as you can get closure out of something as brutal as this is. But again, I hope at some point he will point investigators in the right direction.
That's what we always hope for. And in fact, in the prosecution's closing arguments, they said, you are not here to figure out the motive. No one knows the motive except for that man in that seat right there. And so it will be up to him if he ever wants to talk, which we'll have to see. Yeah, and that was the thing. We were trying to, you know, pick and choose or kind of navigate our way through the testimony, figure out what was a motive. Well, he was having an affair with Crystal Kenny, got her pregnant. She wound up having an abortion, trusted him. We also heard about this situation where Frazee would continually berate her and then tell other people about how much he didn't want to be in that relationship, and somehow was trying to convince people that he was a better parent for their daughter. But at the end of the day, I guess you could add all that up. And then we also heard about possible inheritance that small child would get from the family, that perhaps Patrick Frazee would inherit if Kelsey Barrett was murdered. So again, all those components of a motive in this case were touched upon during the course of that 2-week trial. Absolutely. So we will have no idea on that until he decides to speak and tell his story, which who knows if that will happen. He maintained his innocence throughout this. And also the prosecution in their closing arguments, they talked about how all that Patrick Frazee had said, there was no evidence for that he wasn't there, that someone else did it, that Crystal Kenny planned it all. They said there is no evidence to support his story on this, but all the evidence is there that he killed her and tried to cover it up. Yeah, and getting back to some of that DNA evidence, we did hear from Crystal Kenny during the course of the trial that she was talking about, yes, she cleaned up that just horrific mess as she described it, but also she said that she was trying to leave bits and pieces of evidence in that condominium to get to investigators. And we also heard, again, at least initially, it was a missing persons report. And one of the big arguments from the defense was that, well, police went in there initially, they didn't find anything, they left, and then the family of Kelsey Barrett had to go in, and they were the ones that found the blood stains around the toilet and some other spots. But again, at the end of the day, the evidence was there, and they did do the DNA match, and obviously that was damning evidence. And the timeline and the cell phone evidence that they had with the pings on the different towers, and Patrick Frazee said he was in by Nash Ranch or by his ranch in Florissant, but his phone was dinging off Woodland Park, and they put all of those together, and Kelsey's phone was dinging in Idaho off the tower there, and Crystal Kenny said that she only turned it on to send that text. And yeah, all that phone evidence was a huge deal in this as well, because it really added up with the whole timeline. And as you said, Patrick Frazee had made some phone calls and said, they're listening. One of the phone calls, he said, why does the national media care about this? And his friend said, because she's a beautiful woman with a young child. Why wouldn't they care? And he said, this is the testimony, he said, if I had known that there would be this many eyes on this case, I would have never, but then stopped talking. I've just heard from our producer that right now, as you heard, that they are now going to impose sentence at some point here in the next 15 to 20 minutes. Well, always as part of that process are victim impact statements.
what was the impact of this horrific crime on those affected, the family left behind. And of course, that always has a huge determination as to what sentence is imposed. And again, guilty of first-degree murder with premeditation basically carries that 20-year to life sentence. So again, they want to really make a statement, prosecutors do, about just how horrific this case was, how horrific this person, Patrick Frazee, is and what he did and how he methodically carried this out before they imposed sentence, to make sure that it's perfectly clear that this man deserves life in prison without the possibility of parole.
And we'll have to see if we end up hearing from the family. Sam Kramer is inside there. He will be listening to those, bringing that information to us as soon as we can get it. And we haven't heard from the family since the very beginning, when her mother was pleading for help finding her, saying this is not like her. She is not one to up and leave. Her things are still at her house. She has a baby that she loves. She was planning for a future, which is another thing the prosecution hit on today. She went to the grocery store. She had a cart full of groceries. She was making cinnamon rolls. She was going to make a dip for Thanksgiving. They said this is not a sign of a woman that wants to take her own life or disappear. She was planning for a future. She was planning for a future with Patrick Frazee, while Patrick Frazee was planning to kill her.
Yes, and again, we want to let those folks who are tuning in to our normal programming here this afternoon on News 5 that we are tracking breaking news right now, and we will return to programming when it's appropriate. But again, we're kind of waiting now for this time frame to move forward, to not only hear from District Attorney Dan May, but possibly from jurors after they reach that guilty verdict against Patrick Frazee this afternoon. Also, what kind of sentence was imposed. That takes some time. Our Sam Kramer is inside the courtroom. Our Elizabeth Watts standing by in Cripple Creek right now as we continue our conversation about this case, and covered a lot of murder trials here in southern Colorado, Elizabeth, and this one is gotten a lot of national attention. Sadly, we've had a lot of important cases here in Colorado that got national attention for all the wrong reasons, but this is one of them.
It is, and as I drove through Woodland Park, it's just so sad to think that something happened in such a cute town and that such a big, horrible, disgusting, vile murder happened in this area. It's just horrible to think about. I will say, I came from Las Vegas, and it would take years for any kind of trial when it came to murders. It would take years. And so the fact that this has been done less than a year after her death, that's coming in just a few days, that horrible anniversary, I have to say kudos for getting this done so quickly. That's a good thing, at least, so it's not drawn out for the family.
Absolutely. Elizabeth Watts live in Teller County, Cripple Creek right now. Sam Kramer in the courtroom, again guilty on all 6 counts against Patrick Frazee, first-degree murder with deliberation. Again, we are waiting to hear from the district attorney, also waiting to hear the sentencing. We're going to return you to our programming. Once those decisions are made, we'll cut back into our programming and bring that to you live. Stay with News 5 in this developing story.